Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 111th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And the focus of this month is about the diversity of Black experiences for Black History Month. And in preparation for World Menopause Day, today we're going to be talking about Black menopause. There is a real lack of diversity of information from media outlets, medical information, etc. The fact that very few high-profile Black women have shared their own experiences about menopause, that it's really important to focus on this. And to join me in doing this is Nina Kuypers, the founder of Black Women in Menopause. Nina noticed that she didn't have a place to discuss her menopausal experiences with other Black people. It was as though Black people don't go through the menopause. It was also evident that healthcare professionals were or are not trained in menopause, as well as the cultural element. So this makes the whole process that half the planet goes through even more challenging. Nina wished that she'd known more, and this is why she set up a safe, supportive environment, as well as providing educational events for Black people and people of colour to share their experiences and learn from professionals about menopause and the associated physical differences on how to cope with, for example, dry, coarse, thinning hair, polka dot skin, or dietary aspects from a Black professional or Black professionals. Her aim is to raise awareness of menopause, share experiences, and provide peer support, as well as campaigning for improvements in menopause management and treatments. Menopause is indiscriminate, and there is a significant amount of work that needs to be done to ensure menopause is inclusive and representative, and that care and education supports and reflects all those directly and indirectly affected by the menopause. This is why Black Women in Menopause is part of the Menopause Inclusive Collective group. And Nina also has a particular passion for health and nutrition, with a focus on evidence-based intervention, design, development, and implementation. She has over 25 years of experience in the health, exercise, and nutrition industry. So we are super delighted to have her on the show to talk not only about menopause, but the Black perspective on menopause. So Nina, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure, Layla, to be here today.
Oh, we're just delighted. And I think this, we said this is such an important topic: menopause, mental health, culture, accessibility, support, all of that is going to be a really rich conversation today.
Yep, you hit the nail on the head there with the two, menopause and mental health, the two mms, and not the chocolate variety.
So Nina, what's been your journey then, to your career journey, and how you came to talk about, being Black, the I don't want to say issues, but the connection between being Black and menopause?
As you do on the great World Wide Web of the internet. So after scouring the internet, it's the images that I was greeted with was not what I was expecting, and it just seemed to be lots of white women with their heads in their hands, grey hair, such a terrible time. And it didn't resonate with me on a personal level. And so those images and experience portrayed, for me, I kind of just didn't have a place to discuss with other Black people about their experiences within menopause. And I know there are absolutely fantastic platforms out there. However, it's having that cultural competent conversation as a Black woman going through menopause. So there are certain elements or experiences through menopause that I don't think people always fully understand. So, for example, when I'm concerned about my hair, the last thing I need somebody to say to me is, "You've got a nice thick head of hair." So, it makes the process that I guess half the planet goes through even more challenging because of those cultural elements, and healthcare professionals aren't trained about menopause. And then you add on those additional cultural barriers. It just makes that whole process, as I said, even more challenging.
Yeah, and we know, don't we, the horrific statistic around Black women and birth and maternal mortality rates, and Black women being 5 times more likely to die in childbirth in the UK. So if we think about the other end of it, when our hormones are changing and when we're going through, when women are going through the menopause, and then we add in, as you say, this other element, and you're talking about the hair, of course, it makes complete sense, and people making judgments or saying, oh, you'll be fine. But what people perceive as fine, you don't feel fine in yourself. And being able to have the space to talk about that.
Yeah, you said it there in terms of it's somebody else's experiences until you walk in that person's shoes and you tie their shoelaces. It's very easy to judge and think, oh, well, it shouldn't matter. And you're coupling, and again, in terms of health inequalities, and ultimately for me, it's the first thing that you've got to recognize is it's Black, then it's a woman, and then it's menopause, and all of those health inequalities all in a mix and bowl together. It's trying to fully understand, and I know people don't always recognize, oh, it's not necessarily a thing, but when you view menopause in terms of the Western view, it's largely biomedical, and at the end of the day, that suggests that all of our symptoms should be universal. But when you begin to try and untangle, it's hard to ignore the possible interactions between social, cultural, and biological factors. And those related to culture and diet do have a huge interrelationship in terms of link to the biology as well. So consequently, culture may influence menopause related physiology and symptom occurrence as well. So it's trying to get people to fully understand from where you're coming from in terms of that. And yes, it is a biological aging process of all human females. However, we need to look at other multifactorial things that play into this journey as well.
So that whole idea about the holistic person, also their values, what shaped them. And I think you're absolutely right with diet, how that helps. And your point about it's in the West, how it's seen versus other parts of the world and how it might be embraced or managed in a different way.
Yeah, and there's many different studies, and they often say, oh, Black women suffer more from vasomotor symptoms, but that study was done in America, which is again a completely different culture and environment to the UK. And if you look at research of menopausal women in places like Nigeria, then their symptoms are more prevalent in terms of having joint pain issues. So there's a bigger factor than just saying, oh, well, such and such because of this. As I said, there's multifaceted variables that throw into the mix of menopause and how society views that in relation to aging and women in general as well.
Because of course, skin color is I'm not, this is not a throwaway comment. In some ways it's arbitrary, but of course it's not, because of the way in which so much deprivation and stereotyping has been shaped by that. But of course it's more than that. It's the environment around us and the factors. And of course, growing up in America, and America's very big, Nigeria's huge, there are going to be different environmental factors depending on where you live, how you live, what you've eaten growing up, all of those things. I think that's really, really important to remember, that you can't just say, oh, all people from Black communities will have this symptom, as you rightly said. So how did you then start Black Women in Menopause UK? Like, how did it all come about? How did you get traction for it?
Well, originally, I just think one Sunday evening, I because I'm not massive on social media anyway, because of how it affects people's mental health. So I decided that I'll just throw what I call a Twitter pebble out there into the Twitter world. That seemed to be the easiest platform for me to be able to navigate at the time. Surely there's got to be other Black women out there that are wanting to talk about menopause. yeah, it's a bit like tumbleweed, very few. And I know more and more are beginning to speak about it, and whether that's also a generational thing. I just felt as though, and I'm well versed in health, exercise, nutrition, because that's my background. So I feel as though I've got a basic platform of understanding the body, and that may have helped mask some of my symptoms, and also how my mindset and how I maybe don't always think in terms of how that affects my mental health, because I think maybe I've had that additional step up of being knowledgeable about diet and activity and awareness of sleep. So I just found it odd that there was no groups out there specifically for Black women. And as I said earlier, yes, there are great platforms out there, but when you're having certain conversations, it's still that initial, when I stand up in front of somebody, what do they really see? And I would say the first thing that they see is a Black woman. And then you couple that with menopause, which you can't see. You know, menopause is out of sight and therefore often out of people's minds. They just don't fully understand there are additional implications to our experiences. So I thought, well, surely we need to set up some form of safe, supportive environment where we can talk about it. And then what about providing people with free educational events for people of colour to share their experiences and learn from predominantly Black professionals about menopause and the associated physical and mental differences and emotional differences and how to cope with. So, for example, as I mentioned about concern about my hair, so fortunate to get a Black trichologist in to speak to the women from the group. I've had a Black dietitian, going to have a clinical psychologist. So it's just giving people the knowledge and the information so they can go away and have an informed choice. Not here to say, this is what you should do and go through this process. What works for one doesn't always work for another, but if they've got the information, then they can provide themselves with that informed choice to go forwards and make that next step. So it's about providing people with support.
And eventually that traction grew. Do you think that stigma around talking about menopause for particular cultures is diminishing, or do you think people feel safe to speak about it in the confidential spaces that you've created, the safe spaces you've created online?
I think it's still, we're a long way off. So it's funnily enough, we had a peer support group session last night, and we were trying to unravel why it is that we don't really want to talk about it. And as I say, I think there's such a bigger element to it to try and think about, well, why aren't we talking about it? And even though we do have that safe, supportive environment, there's still something. What is it that's stopping? And that could be down to family. There's so many things that we could just throw and say, well, it could be this, it could be that. So I think it needs to be a bigger investigation, more research on what they need. As I said, there isn't any research to date to be able to untangle race and ethnicity from socioeconomic factors or genetics or environmental influences on menopause. So it's about being on the ground and asking those out there and in the group, what is it? What would they like in terms of that peer support? Because the events that I do, they are well attended, but when we come to do the peer support, they're not so much well attended. So I don't know without fully going away and doing more research. But at the end of the day, for me, if that provides a space for one woman, then that's a job done, because at least then the seed has been planted, and how we nourish that lady's experience will then move forwards in her life. And if, in terms of her children and such, it just begins to have a snowball effect.
Yeah, brilliant. And so building up on that, if I could give you a magic wand, what would be your ideal vision for a culturally competent conversation between women from all backgrounds trying to understand each other and their menopause journeys?
Wow. Excellent question. That magic wand. I think it's to know that this is going to happen and it's okay to talk about it, and that there are spaces that you can talk about it and share experience to give people confidence, because a lot of women will not understand what they're going through and maybe associate it to something else and then being misdiagnosed. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be done in my lifetime.
Wow, yeah.
And I think we need to recognise that at the end of the day, there are people face considerable amounts of discrimination in every area of their lives, and then that bleeds into and informs people's experiences within healthcare, and it affects people's confidence. And if you think about it, not to mention the impact on their quality of life, it makes people less likely to seek or even attend healthcare appointments, or access is sometimes maybe worse. And I noticed, as I said, I didn't have a place to discuss my experiences with other Black people. It was as though Black people don't go through menopause, and in other cultures, and I think there's also, when I say Black, it's the same Afro-Caribbean. They're two different cultures, African and Caribbean. And as we said earlier about diet, two very different dietary needs that play into that. So yeah, that magic wand needs to last quite some time in order for this to go forwards. And the assumption is that we are all the same. Just as many people believe that menopause is the same for all those that go through it. There are, as I said, that considerable other factors as well as the biological perspective. Until we have more research on marginalised populations, then it's going to be very difficult to untangle that race. But in terms of healthcare professionals and more people coming out and talking about it, will certainly start to tip that point and melt that iceberg, or menopause iceberg.
It's the acknowledgement, isn't it? I think first of all, so that it's about equity, not treating everyone the same, as you said, and knowing that people's journeys are going to be different, just as people's menstrual and fertility journeys are all different too.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to acknowledge that there are ingrained biases, and with a lack of information, it does leave people unsupported during menopause. Menopause is indiscriminative.
And what about, so we touched on it a bit, we touched on it at the beginning, but mental ill health, culture, and menopause. So what do you think are the biggest challenges in not only accessing support for however you want to manage your menopause, but also the impacts on mental health and well-being? And how could we be talking about that more?
Well, you said it there, the T word. We've got to keep talking. We've got to stop with these stigma and taboo about mental health and menopause. Because if we don't just make it the normal narrative, then how are people going to appreciate and understand what people are going through? We need to think about what remedial things we would do in a situation and have a plan. So if I cut my leg, we're fine to go to a doctor to see them in terms of to get that stitched back up. But with regards to the thing above the neck, the head, we just don't recognize that it's okay to also see somebody about what's going on. We're very complex beings, so we need to proactively protect our mental health, but at the same time, we need to just fully understand as a duty of care, that bigger picture, that we need to recognize that it is okay not to be okay. Not just the physical element, the mental element is such a huge, important factor.
I think it can be easier to suffer in silence, though, can't it, Nina? I think many of us might be used to that, or we think no one really wants to listen. Who cares? No one else seems to be going through this. It must just be me. I better shut up and get on with it. Yes, I think it's great to talk, but I think even opening your mouth sometimes to talk about how you're feeling is really tough. So then, of course, I'm not denying there's stigma in society, but we also put a lot of stigma on ourselves, don't we? Or we can do, depending on, who the person is and their lived experiences.
Yeah, and we need to try and foster and change that environment, instigate conversations, engage. And yes, I'm not going to say, oh, yeah, I constantly talk myself. There are other things that I will do first of all. And it is hard because you think people don't want to listen, that you think people don't want to help. But again, that's just that naughty assumption, it makes an ass out of you and an ass out of them. if you don't try and have that balance of scales, scales of justice for your own health. And we do need to recognize that. And yeah, it is. I think it's going back to basics and looking at other elements first of all. If we think of it like an onion, we peel back. Let's look at other elements to how we can help and proactively keep our minds ticking over, and then move to other elements and try and get people to rethink that just because when you've got toothache, you'll go and see a dentist, but you'll go and have checkups unless you like to have that pain. And only when you're in pain you appreciate, I probably should have gone for more checkups. And I think that's also key as well, that we've got to recognize that maybe, if we talked about, yes, I've got doctors, I've got a dentist, yes, I've got a therapist that I like to talk to, but again, it's that stigma, that's that culture. And I think in time, the more we keep scratching away, again, I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, but I'm conscious even with my son to instill in him it's important to talk, and what's up in this head that we cannot see. Who knows what people think and do, and you don't want it to be too late.
No, and that makes me think about perimenopause. Do you think with, depends on generation potentially, but there's been more talk around perimenopause as well. Do you think that might help then on this journey for people talking more about menopause and how they're feeling mentally, and also the discussions around COVID itself, the COVID vaccine, because of course if COVID can throw your menstrual cycles out of kilter, it's put people into early menopause. Now I don't wish that on anyone, and of course the vaccine can mimic some of those symptoms in people. Do you think that can be a driver to help us talk about this a bit more? Could we use this as an opportunity?
I would say, use anything that drives something forwards. So yes, it's important. If people are being thrown into perimenopause earlier, then we need to, again, recognize that there are things, and educate and inform, because we are well versed in the art of periods and pregnancy, but yet, I'm 48 and I've been postmenopausal since 45. So I've got over half my lifetime going through this. And if I'd known, and as I say, I've been fortunate that my background is in health, exercise and nutrition, maybe I've staved off some of the symptoms, or I've just carried on. But if we make people more aware of, well, this can happen, and they say there are 34 symptoms, but I believe we know our bodies best. And when something isn't right, you're probably more often than not, you're right to understand that you're going through something physically, emotionally, and mentally. That perimenopause is that time leading up to menopause, where we will experience many different changes. And it isn't just about irregular periods. It may be palpitations. It may be loss of confidence, poor concentration, low mood, difficulty. I was going to say swimming, difficulty sleeping. that could be, that could, strange body odor, itchy skin, an increase in allergies and tolerances, digestive issues. So, yeah, it's certainly a driver to keep this conversation going. We've got to check and challenge in order to change the narrative.
And so what do you think workplaces can do to introduce culturally specific support around menopause at work? There's been increased conversations around this. I think there are lots of organizations doing work, but they do, as you said, do tend to be centered around the white female experience. So what are your suggestions? What also, if employers are working with employee assistance programs, what can workplaces do to support this cultural element around menopause at work?
It's their attitudes, their perceptions and expectations. We need to have an environment that fosters where we can openly and comfortably instigate conversations or engage in discussions about menopause, because it does not just directly affect those that identify as female, but it indirectly affects everybody else around them as well. Ensure that everybody understands what menopause is. I think it's important, yes, to have a policy, but there's no good having a policy if it's not actionable. So just because it's down in black and white, we'll look at this, we've got a 16-page policy, but what are people actually doing? Are they educating and informing those around, so managers, about the potential symptoms, what support can be in place if somebody is suffering from menopause symptoms? Do you have that environment that they feel confident to be able to discuss and ask for support? Are they able to have some reasonable adjustments that they can continue their jobs? I think they're going to have to be careful because it is linked to the Health and Safety Act. So we need to ensure that employers do have a responsibility to be committed to supporting the needs of their workforce.
Yeah, and also the case in Scotland. So under the Equality Act, menopause can come under a disability if it has a substantial adverse impact on day-to-day activities for 12 months or more, as was shown through that case.
And it's the same with mental health as well. And I think unless you don't know what to be able to challenge with. Companies do have a duty of care. They need to see the bigger picture. And the changing age of the workforce in the UK, it's significantly percentage of menopausal women.
And anything around the cultural aspect of it. So completely agree with you around spotting signs. So actually, when I have some case studies, and one of the case studies I have is, someone in your team is going through the menopause, and often male managers will say, I would check that she would, that my female member of staff would want to speak to me because maybe they don't, and we should have some menopause champions. So you do get these discussions, but of course, if I'm training them, they're the workplaces that are wanting to embrace that. But anything about culture specifically as well, thinking about, Black Lives Matter, the ongoing movement, things have not been solved. We know that. And how we can really integrate this into people's thinking. Like you said, you don't want a 16-page policy that sits on the intranet or on a dusty shelf or virtual shelf. So how could we bring this to life a little bit on the culture side?
Fantastic question. Culture, race in workplace coupled with menopause. I suppose it goes back to what I said earlier about having ingrained biases, and we do need to recognise that. So, for example, when England lost, what did organisations do to support their black employees after coming in after England losing? And then you got to take it from a woman's perspective of being menopausal, and I think people don't want to acknowledge that there are biases sometimes. So, yeah, it's a fantastic question that I think if we had to go away and what could we really do to have that support, have within the workplace where you can go and have that or instigate that conversation, check in on people. And when you throw in the word menopause in there for women, then yeah, it's menopause and being like indiscriminative education support is ultimately the key. I haven't got an answer to it because it's a very grey, muddled area, I think. You know, that's where I'm coming from in terms of a personal perspective. It's easy to say and do rather than do, I think. I really don't know, because it goes back to that very beginning of what I said. If I said to people, and we've all got unconscious biases, whether people want to acknowledge that, but what you really see if I stood in front of you, and this is what I believe myself, is you'll say black and then woman, and then everything else that comes after that, the menopause and things that happen from childhood all the way through because of racism, then I think people dismissing how we feel, and or you're overreacting, or you're denying there's a problem, and you're reading injustice statistics across health and education.
It's big, isn't it?
The ingredients there, I don't know what is going to come out to be made, what that cake will look like. Each different time the ingredients of something will change, and that cake won't come out
how it's meant to, or how it should. Or it'll be, I have a phrase, Nina, called icing the moldy cake. So there's a cake, it's really gross and it's moldy, and then people put beautiful icing on it, and then you cut it and you go, ooh. So it can be that kind of thing, can't it?
Yeah. And I suppose that a different analogy would be, you know, you've got a leak in your bathroom, and you get the mop out, you mop it up, and then something else, and until it bursts, then I've gone round and around about it.
So just thinking about, you know, you this work that you do, the groups that you run, they are, you know, it's emotional, and your own menopause journey. So how do you look after your own mental health, Nina, and what are your top 3 tips?
Oh, wow. So I think that I have somehow proactively been protecting my own mental health unknowingly, and I'm grateful for that through the things that I've done through my life is activity, nutrition, and sleep. And I've managed to cultivate somehow my own mental wellness. But then when I think about it more, then I need to take more time out to talk. And I should, in fact, and I said about this earlier, I need to fully embrace getting myself a therapist, whether I use them or not, but address the problem before that problem actually happens. If that makes sense.
Yeah, proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah, I think about the dangers, and if we are proactive, then recognize the signs, because you just never know.
So you've got the tools at your fingertips if you need them.
Yes, got the tools at the fingertips, and yes, talking to friends. It's not always easier talking to friends. So talking to somebody that you don't know can also have, I think, an impact. So yeah, my 3 things are activity, being able to recognize and talk to others, and have some form of therapist, psychologist, just like I do having a doctor at the surgery or, you know, a boss at work.
Brilliant, thank you. I was going to say, if your manager's great, then that's brilliant, isn't it? But I think
yeah, and it's different for different things. Just because these are for me doesn't mean that they work for others. But, you know, find ways to decrease stress. Meditate, you know, activity is my meditation. Sleep is a massive thing for myself, a diet. So yeah, I suppose other things, yeah, talking and recognizing and having somebody who is a professional to be able to, I probably would slide that in.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nina. Really helpful. And so I'm very much hoping that people are going to be listening. They're going to want to join. They're going to know more about how to get involved. So if people want to know more about the work and what you do, how should they contact you, get involved? And I will, of course, include the links in the show notes.
So on email, blackwomenmenopause@gmail.com. You have a private and public Facebook group, Black Women in Menopause. On Twitter, BLK Menopause, and on Instagram, Black Women in Menopause as well.
Brilliant. And I know you've got some events coming up as well. So I don't know if you wanted to mention them. So you've got,
give them a shout out.
Yeah, give them a shout out, or if you want me to do it.
So yeah, we've got 2 events on Thursday, the 21st of October at 7:30. I was going to say British summertime, but I think we're past that now. And that's the pelvic floor session with a black specialist of looking at menopause and the pelvic floor and beyond. We've also got one in the 25th of November, again on a Thursday, Black Menopause 101 with a Black British Menopause Society specialist. And then another event that will occur in January, which will be the 2 hidden taboos, mental health and menopause, again with a Black specialist clinical psychologist.
Brilliant. And you're also
these are all free. There is no charge at all, and they're bookable via Eventbrite under Black Women in Menopause.
Thank you, Nina. And you're also part of the Menopause Collective. So I didn't know if you wanted to mention a little bit about that and how you participate and what the Menopause Collective, the aim is.
So Black Women in Menopause is part of the Menopause Inclusive Collective group, and that's viewing menopause through all different camera lenses, as I like to put it. So it doesn't matter, even though I say we're Black Women in Menopause, it doesn't matter who you are. Anybody is welcome to come along. And I'd probably say menopause is just indiscriminative.
Okay, indiscriminate, yeah.
Yeah, we just need to ensure that menopause is inclusive and it's representative, and that care, education, support reflects all those that are directly and indirectly affected by menopause. And that's why Black Women in Menopause is part of the Menopause Inclusive Collective group.
Thank you, Nina. That has been so interesting and a really great conversation, and something I've been wanting to do for a long time. A, to talk about menopause, and B, to talk about menopause from a Black global majority female perspective. So thank you so much for your wisdom. Please, listeners, get involved, check it out. You know, whether you identify as being in menopause or not, or, you know, it's still really worth it for referral and to understand more. And we'll see you in the next episode, where we're going to be talking to Talia Loderick, a money coach, about global majority women, money and mental health. So until the next episode, we'll see you then. Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.